Hey everyone, welcome back. It's been a busy week, but I definitely wanted to get out something to talk about the new patch, the new ranked reset. And you know how much I love just talking about the game and changes and sort of theory crafting. So I definitely just wanted to come into the patch notes pretty fresh. I had glanced at them like once, but I have not really read through it and taken in that information. So I thought we'd make a quick one to come out for today, and then I will probably get into building some Yanling decks and throwing that up on the channel. And I'll probably just offer some thoughts of like what I would recommend to climb in this video, and then in the future I'll do my classic, sort of meta tier update. And it seems like folks have really enjoyed that. So, yeah, for those who have really been into that content, we'll have more of that coming. Always feel free to comment and request if there's other things that we can put up on the channel. And we're at 90 subscribers. We're almost at 100, which is really exciting. So definitely, if you're digging the channel, please like, please subscribe, and tell me what you think. So I'm down to just kind of read through this with y'all. I've got some Magic Spellslingers music in the background, getting ready to maybe work on some of the climb. But yeah, we are in a new patch, which I was not expecting. I knew Yanling was going to get released, but I didn't know if that meant balance changes. And to be honest, like it's nice to have to think a little bit harder, after basically like 2 months where yeah, the meta shifted, but you know, uh, it's also just nice to have a new planeswalker in the mix, quite frankly. So welcome to this patch. Overall, the meta has been the best it's been since the soft launch of the game. I do think I agree with that. We're seeing a wide variety of spell slingers, be competitive, and no one is dominating like in past seasons. As such, we're taking a more conservative approach to balance changes this time. Totally agree with this approach, right? Like, yes, Teferi has kind of been like the boogie man of the format in some ways, but like other people probably would make the argument for like Liliana, which to me they both have their kind of benefits and drawbacks of like, do you want to play against them or not? And I personally, I've been playing a lot of Domri, um, and got to number 10 with that. Although they took the snapshot when I was at 17, unfortunately, but that's okay. Um, and like I still feel like there are plenty of decks that are still very competitive, and it's really just about how well do you know the matchups, how well do you know to mulligan, and do you have a strategy on how to win the game every time you're playing against these matchups. So I think it's great that they're not trying to do anything like super big. They're not like, oh hey, we think this planeswalker's the worst. Here's a huge buff, because that can really just throw everything kind of into a chaotic place. So I think the softer approach is usually, better received, right? So this is Yanling. For anyone who hasn't seen, we have a video up on the channel just kind of reacting to her. Um, and I think still the consensus is that she is probably going to underperform. Um, I've been hearing from my teammates who are already, rank one or like already on the mythic climb, which is really impressive. Um, are saying that yeah, they lose games to this deck, but overall it doesn't feel, tremendously powerful. There's been talk of, do you build it as blue white flyers aggressive? Do you put Delver in your deck? Do you put other flyers in your deck? Do you put the devil in your deck, right? Because when it dies, it deals damage to your opponent, and also when it connects, because they don't want to block it, it deals damage to your opponent, right? So I think there is people are already starting to theory craft. I think some really great potential uses for Yanling, um, but we'll see if she really, has enough steam to really make an impact on the metagame. People are going to play her, absolutely. I'm going to play her. I want to test her out. Um, but I would be surprised if she's, you know, I guess like S tier or like top tier, sort of at the end of that. I would be a bit surprised, but I'm down with her to be good. I'm just not sure we're quite there yet. So, without further ado, let's get into some of the balance changes because I think that's going to be the most fun. Sorry for the scrolling. I'll try and keep it to a minimum. Um, okay. Sarah's getting her health reduced a little bit, and her premier 2-drop, which is definitely her best signature card, 2 mana 2/2, is becoming a 2 mana 2/1. Alright, so their logic here, these changes are meant to weaken Sarah's matchups against creature-based aggro decks, while we expect her to be favored against most ultra aggro decks, which makes sense, right? She's healing herself, she's healing her creatures. She's overperforming against them, and this should bring her more in line with our expectations. What's interesting is she definitely does make playing aggro harder, but I felt like because aggro was so like not present for a while in the meta, that it was like, well, who cares if a deck beats up on aggro? Those decks aren't even that good anymore. But I do think they are, uh, with this sort of change, they're basically saying, hey, we want to give a nod to aggro. We want it to be a viable strategy. We want it to be something that people feel can beat, these sort of like white mid range decks. Um, and I mean, I've always felt like Sarah Control or Sarah mid range was just way more powerful because you have ways to close the door with a chroma and like buffering her power, with the 6/4 flyer that she can play, and because she can play all of these different cards that are in white, she just has a lot of versatility. Um, so my kind of take is like, yes, we're opening the door to aggro by making changes like this, and I generally do support that. Um, if aggro decks are still just not that great in the meta, this change might just not really do much. But we'll see. I mean, I like the intention here, and I think it's subtle, and I think that's the way you want to go. Um, Jace looks like is getting a health buff, so their logic here, right? Perhaps unsurprisingly, Jace has struggled to find his footing in the last round of changes. We want Jace to be a reasonable control deck that has multiple avenues to victory, and the first step is making him able to extend the game. So, for those of you who were not tuned in, basically 2 months ago, Laboratory Maniac Jace was just like one of the most, present decks in the format. Very toxic, very impossible to interact with. That's just my interpretation. So of course, when they nerfed him, it was obviously going to be a pretty big step back, and so Jace definitely has been struggling. I mean, I think Logan actually is a really huge Jace player and like is always innovating and trying to make Jace viable. I've never really liked the Planeswalker all that much. Just don't really find what he's doing all that interesting. But I think everyone should have the ability to play like a blue control deck, and that's what Jace does. And whether that's using Helion as your win condition, Laboratory Maniac as your win condition. I've seen people play blue green like ramp, and or like play Titans and stuff like that, and we'll get to some of those changes. So, Jace being a viable control option, I think, is is nice. I mean, it maybe Jace being a little bit more present makes aggro a little bit more present, right? I mean, they want him to live against aggro. I do think that's pretty tough at times. Um, yeah, I think it's totally a fine change, right? Okay, Teferi is a tough spell slinger to play against. Boy, you said it here, Magic Spell Slingers. Getting your cards countered and then healing off of it is like salt in the wound. Yeah, I think the most feel bad against Teferi is like you're trying to balance the information that you have, which is very little. Um, and even with that, Teferi's staff just convolutes any of your decision making, right? Because it can just be any trap. And it really does feel bad, especially when they're like living against you and, one for oneing you, which can be really powerful when you're one for oneing, and then every time you do that, you draw 2 cards, right, after you've done it 3 times. So Teferi's Acolyte getting nerfed down to a 2/4 definitely makes where like Colonian Tusker, right, for green decks can effectively attack through it. That's definitely a noticeable change. Any of the other 4 power aggressive creatures, right? One of which we're going to talk about here, I did notice in the change, which I think is going to shake some stuff up. Um, yeah, I mean, I think a 3 mana 2/4 that still cheapens one of your better traps is like totally serviceable. But it's, yeah, I mean, I think it's a change that does open the door a little bit toward more aggressive strategies. Um, Yeah, and it looks like a very similar approach for Absorb, right? We're reducing Teferi's ability to block early by taking one health off of the Acolyte. Sorry, we already went over that. Absorb going from heal 3 to heal 2. Um, it's funny, like, sometimes you look at these numbers and you're like, oh, 1 health? Like, how much is that going to do? But just think about how many situations where, like, Teferi's at, like, 5 health, 8 health, right, when you're losing games. Or if you just shut the door that one turn and they had a little bit less health, right, they weren't able to stabilize. Health really does matter for these kind of control strategies, and when you take even just a little bit off, it opens the door for more aggressive strategies, and if those aggressive strategies get better, then it's kind of like twofold nerf against what Teferi is doing. So, um, right, their logic here, right, we're also reducing the healing effect of here to decrease his survivability and make him feel, make, I guess, less of these moments of feeling bad, which just with the way Teferi plays, it's kind of like you can't really know what to run into. I really liked, when I played in Logan's community tournament, what I loved about doing that was getting to see his take on how I was playing. One of the things he said that just like has always stuck with me is, and I'll explain my thought process too, but he was like, usually you just need to attack if you're playing aggro mid range, see what damage you can do, and then decide what spells you want to play. And it's funny because in Magic the Gathering, that's really true for the most part, right? You give information to your opponent when you play spells out during your turn before attacking, right? Because now they're not worried about a combat trick, they're not worried about a counterspell, they're not worried about a specific threat. They have all the information, and your opponent gets perfect information to decide how they want to respond to you, right, in your attack. So, but in my mind, I was like, oh well, let me see if I can fish out and absorb, or like if I do, I know I can get my big creature through that's not going to get immolating glared. And I think the logic works for both, but I do think because Teferi tends to have, although he does tend to have more combat oriented things, it's more important for you to like check to resolve spells, and it's easier to tell that than to check to resolve combat damage. Um, I think in other words, it's like it's easier to see clearly if there's an immolating glare on the board, if there might be, because it's going to trigger right as you attack, and you can basically confirm, okay, they've got 3 mana up, they did not immolating glare. Sure, it could be the vindictive shot, but the fact that they held that up and they're going to have to answer this creature, okay, or like the fact that they held this up, they didn't do anything. I don't have that much pressure. They might just be holding up absorb here, right? So, I think hurting Teferi's survivability gives you a little bit more room to work with, right? And when you can pressure him more effectively, like getting certain attacks and resolving your spells, might get a little easier to navigate what he's doing, even because even when you don't have as much information, because Teferi is just really concealing everything that they're doing. So I'm I'm looking forward to it. I would really like to not have to worry too much about Teferi as a planeswalker. I would love for it to come up. I want people to have fun with it, build it however they want. But I feel like there's been just so much focus on him in this last patch, in this last meta, rather. So I'm happy that the patch is kind of addressing that. So there's a lot of thoughts on Teferi. Let's keep going here. All right, Nissa, definitely a planeswalker that I think is generally really fun for people to play, and for people to like iterate on deck building, but definitely to me has only really done well against certain mid range slash aggro variants, and really doesn't have a place in a lot of ways for dealing with control decks. Um, but so this change is interesting. So what they're saying here, Nissa could use some help in the early and mid game as she ramps up to her true power. This change makes dropping the sign earlier more appealing. Yeah, I mean, having a creature that's like untargetable for a turn, potentially as a threat, but also just fills in your curve well, definitely does make it harder for aggro and like more aggressive but scaling up mid range decks to beat her down. Like I already felt as a Domri player that Nissa has a pretty good matchup into Domri. But you can still curve out, you can still hit your lava waves ahead of curve, all that sort of things to clear the board. But this might really help shore up, Nissa to be a bigger player in the format. And I do think Nissa's interesting because her deck building is kind of wild, and you can do a lot of different things. So I'm definitely supportive of this kind of subtle change for her early and mid game. Okay, the Titans have gone down in cost, and now they are going up in power. So lowering their cost moved the Titans in the right direction, which I do agree, but we think they could use another small push to make a competitive splash. So, why are they doing this, right? We've seen Grave Titan. If you played against some Kiora decks, you've definitely seen Primeval Titan. If you played against certain, Sarah decks, you've seen Sun Titan. But who are the two Titans we've never seen? Frost Titan, Inferno Titan, right? Inferno has just never had a home, I guess, aside from maybe like big red Chandra decks. Like, I don't really know what that looks like. And Frost Titan, could have had a home in Kiora to some degree. Maybe Jace, I guess. But, they just haven't packed enough of a punch, at least with those two cards, to do anything. I mean, I think Frost Titan, the ability to stun something when it comes into play and when it attacks is not bad. Like, all these things are random, right? So I think that's what's tough. Like, Primeval Titan, you're getting a gem. Grave Titan, you're getting a zombie. Sun Titan, you're at least getting, you're getting a creature, right? Whereas Frost Titan, you don't know which creature you're going to stun, and Inferno Titan, you don't know what enemy you're going to hit. So just design wise, they are a lot weaker. But 7/7 stats is pretty tough to deal with. Unless you're resolving Crater Hoofs and Domri, unless you are going super, super tall with a Johnny. I mean, these cards might just now be strong enough that you want to devote a 6-drop slot to them. So we'll see. I mean, if Aggro's getting a bump, it's hard to tell if these cards are quite good enough to come back into the fold. But I really, I think Titans are really fun. I think a lot of folks like them. And it's definitely going to make it so I think Primeval Titans and even more auto-include in sort of mid-range or like green ramp strategies, Nissa, Kiora. I think Sun Titan probably shows up in, obviously, Sarah, but like I've heard of control versions of Kaya, potentially playing the card. And Grave Titan's obviously just going to have a great home in Liliana. So we'll see if Inferno Titan and Frost Titan can get in there. I think Frost Titan's probably a little bit better because 3 damage to a random enemy is just kind of like maybe not good enough. But we will see. I hope these guys come into the fold in some sort of way. Cerulean Dragon, man, such an old card for this game. It's so funny, and I remember when I first started playing the game, I thought it was really, crazy with certain decks. Like I think it was Ral I was playing it with. I was like, oh man, this thing can get so big so fast. And then I don't think I've even thought about that card in like a good almost 3 months. So it's really funny to see this here. So let's talk about it for a second. So it's going from a 4-mana 2/2 flyer to a 3-mana 1/2 flyer. So that's interesting. They want it to be cheaper, and I will say, as someone who really appreciates curving out, and really prioritizes that in decks, I think cheaper cards tend to be more impactful, more consistent. So, blue control has struggled since the nerfing of Lab Maniac, absolutely. This and the following change are meant to buff blue control decks without directly affecting the Maniac. Blue is also one of the hardest colors to play when you have a growing collection, and so adding power to the Cerulean Drake could make blue more competitive early on the ladder. Such a great way of like understanding something that players are probably dissatisfied with. And for anyone tuning in who saw my beginner sort of deck, like when you get started with MTG Spellslingers, like what should you be building? And notice the only blue deck I even cared to mention was Kiora, right? Because she's a mid-range deck that has ways to close the game out. Like any other blue control strategy is kind of awkward, and you need specific threats, specific answers, specific interaction. So I really like this change of like we recognize people are not playing blue when they play this game as much, especially when they start out, because we don't really have staple blue control cards that really incentivize players to be playing those strategies. Cerulean Dragon is still clearly vulnerable to a lot of pieces of removal, but if you're because it's cheaper, what it allows you to do is play this on turn 6, 5, 6, or 7, where you play it and you play a spell that draws you cards, right? And so you're getting the ability to play it a little bit cheaper, right, alongside cards that are going to buff it. Um, so I think that's an interesting take. I'm already more interested, honestly, in Winter Grip Mage going from a 1/3 for 2 to a 2/3 for 2, and adding a Chill Wind. I mean, this is just it's like the Venom Scorpion for blue, right? It's like taking a creature out, although, dooming a creature is obviously more removal than chilling a creature with Chill Wind. But I like this. I mean, I already look at this card and I'm like, oh, this is a card I want to be putting in my deck. Um, so I love that we're going to get a bit more love towards blue control strategies because even though I don't love that really in this game, and never have been like super interested in playing like blue control, I want other players to be able to play it. So I think that's kind of exciting for those folks, especially starting out. All right, what do we do to Awoken Horror? I guess it was about time. Okay, we went from a 6/5 to a 5/4. And let's hear what they were thinking here. Backside of Thing in the Ice is proven to be too punishing when flipped early. Boy, is that true. Weakening the stats should prevent some of the ultra explosive starts we're seeing with this card and make it less likely to snowball your way to victory. Yeah, I mean, 4 toughness gets hit by Flame Coil. It's easier to kill with what is it, Flame Shot from Chandra, right, which deals 3. You've got it's more susceptible to 4-power creatures, right? Like, obviously, I'm a green player, right? I mean, we definitely talked about that a lot on the channel. So, the fact that a Colonian Tusker can attack through this, block this effectively, right? I'm trying to think of other 4-power creatures. Yeah, I mean, even the 2/1 for 1, that's a werewolf that flips into a 4/3, right? Can effectively block this. Yeah, so it's still gonna be backbreaking when you just go turn 1 thing in the ice when you're on the draw, and flip it, stun their thing or kill their thing, attack for 5. But getting essentially 1 extra life to work with, and 1 less toughness to have to deal with, it does make a difference. Um, it means when Ral doesn't have as explosive draws, this card's just not going to be as scary. Which I think is a helpful way to approach it, a subtle way. So this is cool. I did not know that Wrong Turn had any change, so I'm already intrigued by this. Okay, Wrong Turn. 3 less with Miracle, now going to 4 less with Miracle. Okay, so instead of going from 6 mana to 3 mana, it's going from 6 mana to 2 mana. The best case scenario for this card was just not good enough. Agreed. Now the upside in the Miracle turn should be high enough for it to make its way into a deck as a single target removal spell. So this is interesting. I mean, Black's always playing, Flagrant Foul, right? And that's kind of like the main Black, point removal. And Wrong Turn, honestly, was kind of clutch whenever I would draw it off of Isochron Scepter when I was playing WoW. That was the only time I ever saw this card played. But definitely going from 6 mana to 2 mana when you Miracle, pretty noticeable. I mean, 2 mana unconditional removal, obviously that's just strictly better than Flagrant Foul. But of course, like, that's if you Miracle it. So when you don't Miracle it, it's going to be a lot worse. But Miracle is kind of inherently like decent in the game, right? You're starting with 4 or 5 cards in your opening hand. You're obviously going to mull this if it's in your opening hand. If you have ways to draw cards, right, so you're going to increase your likelihood of miracling it. So it's interesting. I mean, definitely a card worth considering in maybe like certain kind of mid-range black strategies or like more control black strategies. Um, so I'll be interested to see if this card shows up a bit. All right, Champion of the Perished. This was actually a change I remember talking about a lot with MTG SS, our team. Like, how do we incentivize players to not just build zombie reanimator, but actually like go wide zombie? Um, because it's and people should play reanimator if they like it, they want to do it, but clearly Chandra Liliana also just has the ability to go wide with zombies, and Champion of the Perished obviously is one of the biggest sort of payoffs for doing that, right? So I think it's somewhat what they say here, right? The most popular Liliana decks are Reanimator, but playing a straight zombie deck is also an appealing strategy that we want to be top tier. This change helps the card trade off if you don't start pumping it, makes it an easier value proposition than before, right? So you can play this on turn one, right? If you have a mana gem, and then turn two, you could potentially go double one drop zombie, and this thing becomes a 5/3 on turn two. You might have to watch out for some like really aggressive Liliana strategies with this change. I think it might shake things up a bit in the zombie Liliana department, and I figured this was coming. I knew they were probably going to look at Soul Sever Lich and Grimgrin, and I think that's correct. I think, again, it's not about taking a whole like archetype away. It's about making it so that there's a bit more flexibility, right? So, definitely agree with their note here. Liliana Reanimator was able to close out games like very effectively once either of these are on the board. I would say like Grimgrin is way more backbreaking. Um, and Soul Sever Lich like has an inevitability, but you can sometimes like play around it. But Grimgrin in certain board states is just shuts the door completely. Um, so I like this because I love playing Domri. This is not a good matchup for Domri, and Liliana pretty much has. I think they even make a note here, right? We want to slow down the speed at which this mid-range deck can shut the door on slower control-based decks. Honestly, I think it shuts the door on mid-range control and aggro. So I think definitely slowing it down is the way to go. And Grimgrin going from a 9/8 to an 8/7. So it's not smacking you as hard when you have to take the damage because you don't want to trade off creatures because you don't want to resummon it so it can take one of your creatures. Um, not a huge change, but definitely will help slow things down a bit, which I think is good. And Stitcher Scob. Oh, interesting. I don't know why they didn't put this with Teferi. Okay, so they're changing the Scob from a base 2 mana 2/2 that can get buffs to a base 2 mana 1/1. Yeah, I mean, it's alive as a powerhouse card. I mean, I think Teferi is so oppressive in the sense of like he pressures you to be doing stuff, but then if you're like trying to slow roll and trying to be efficient, he'll just play It's Alive with like 7 or 8 mana up, and then you're like, oh crap, I have to catch up now, because of the nature of how traps work. You have to be proactive, and then if you don't want to be proactive because you don't want to get countered or something else, right? Then they just punish you by playing a trap that like basically has haste, right? Just a giant creature that has haste the next turn, um, or like it becomes your turn and then it can attack. It's just really effective. So I mean, this definitely makes it so you have to play It's Live later, and it's not as good early. But to be honest, I think you're playing Teferi wrong if you're ever playing this like on turn 5 or 6. Maybe that's a strong statement, but I think you're just always saving this for when it's going to be like a massive problem for your opponent. So, not a huge change, but again, you know, we're going low and slow, and I think that's the way to do it. This is really interesting. Bag of Tricks. So, going from 2 charges to 3 charges, I mean, 2 mana for 2 charges to draw 2 creatures, right? I mean, it is a random beast, right? That costs 3 or less. You can't really. It's not like Alarm Bell where you're like, oh, these are my 2 drops that I could draw, right? I did play against an Angrath deck that was running this pre-nerf, or pre-buff, rather. And I thought it was interesting because for some of the aggressive red decks, which like just haven't really been in the meta, this just this card does feel like it's got some meat to it. Um, and I think they mentioned this here, right? Red only has a few ways to generate card advantage, and this was one that never really seemed to make the cut. Increasing the number of charges should deepen deck building decisions when considering. I think it's Scalper's Stand. I think is the main one. Um, so I think it could be a good, yeah, like just card advantage engine for more aggressive red strategies. Or maybe you're going big red and you need some early like twos and three drops, and Bag of Tricks helps you do that. So definitely an interesting change, and I really do love when we're looking at cards we just never look at. Um, so I like seeing something that I would not have expected to be changed. Mindless Rage, okay. So right, this is the deal damage to a random enemy creature equals the strongest power. It's going from 3 mana to 2 mana. Yeah, I mean, Barbarian classes just always struggled to be relevant. Right, I think the ones that see the most play are Paladin and Wizard. I think then followed by, I guess, maybe like Druid, and then I guess like Barbarian and Warlock are pretty tied. I mean, Warlock class is really good early on, I would say, when you're climbing. I don't think it really has a great home right now, but I think Mindless Rage going to 2 when you're playing decks like Nahiri, which I think is one of the best Barbarian decks, really easy to give anything like 3, 4, 5 power. And making this cheaper is going to definitely put up the pressure, right? It's coming out of full turn sooner, potentially. So that's there's definitely some. I'm already sort of feeling that like red decks might be a little bit more present, um, with these kind of nods towards aggro, with the scaling back of some control. Um, it feels like maybe there's going to be a bit more room for these more aggressive strategies. Eternal Phoenix. Okay, first off, I love all the Phoenix cards in Magic the Gathering, and I hope that this could be a card too, because I generally like these sorts of things. So, we're bringing it from a 4 mana 2/2 to a 3 mana 2/1. Again, I think I like these sort of trade offs of like, all right, we want this card to be more competitive. We're gonna, make it maybe a weaker body, but we're gonna make it cheaper. And I do think that opens the door more easily. So, all right, the Phoenix was too expensive. 100% agree. But reducing the cost, it opens up possible Phoenix builds. And for those who have never seen this card, which I wouldn't blame you, right? It's a flyer and it says Miracle. For the rest of the game, this card gets a random upgrade at the end of turn. If this is in your deck, or sorry, in your graveyard, put it in your deck. Um, if there was a way to put this in your Teferi deck, oh boy, that would be pretty crazy, right? Because you just can get the card back and kill it and get it back or whatever. Maybe Phoenix. I mean, my first question when I saw this card was like, can we play it in Vivian, right? Because it's just getting free upgrades and all that. It still might not be strong enough. I don't really know where this wants to be as a card, but we'll see. Maybe it makes the cut this time round. Blitzing Minotaur. Okay. So this is funny. I did not play during beta, and apparently this was the original stat line. Um, I mean, this card was already as a 3 mana 3/3 haste like a very reasonable creature to be playing in red aggressive strategies. But I will say like it it's a card that I would play in my Chandra deck, in my Nahiri deck potentially, but I never was like, you're not excited to play this card because it's just such a fair card. But bumping it to a 4/3 that has haste, I think is kind of a big game. Um, Being able to be a hasted Colonian Tusker 1 mana more does seem like you can curve out and like really lay the beat down, right? I mean, being able to either remove their 1 or 2 drop, play this, smack your opponent for 4, and then likely trade up. Um, it also goes through, the nerfed Teferi Acolyte, right? Very effectively. Um, I mean, I feel like this change to Minotaur makes red green aggressive strategies or just like red aggressive strategies like a lot more attractive. So I am kind of interested to see where where this goes. All right, let's see what's up with Young Pyromancer. All right, 4 mana. Whoa, okay. This card was too difficult to deal with when it came out early. Could still win you games, but now it supports more of a mid-range strategy. Interesting. It's a three, from 3 mana to 4 mana. It's a 3/3 now. Because it was a 3/2 for 3 mana. Yes. Okay, so a little bit more resilient to removal, but definitely costs a bit more. Um, Interesting. I mean, I think the attractiveness of Pyromancer 4 Ral is that it was relatively cheap, right? You could go play it on turn 3, um, or I would say usually the earliest would be 4, because then you can use Ral's signature card to draft a card for 0, play a 1 mana card, and then you get your free discount by 2 on the rest of your spells. So Pyromancer is definitely not going to be a part of those explosive Ral draws anymore, which definitely is a nerf to Ral. Like, Ral is getting less and less tools to be like so crazy explosive. So I think Ral is definitely going to shift more to this like mid-rangey kind of variant, and I think Young Pyromancer might still have a home there, but I do think it's a pretty significant thing in a deck that really craves cheap threats. That this is going to 4 mana, and you can't really there's no way to really discount it, right? For Ral anyway. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see less of this card in that build. Um, so we'll see how that turns out. I'm not sure exactly. Okay, Pasture Prowler. I did not think a 2 mana 3/4, which is what Watch Wolf was, that gives your opponent a 1/1, even though it's a green creature, so you can maybe put it in more green decks. I did not think that that was good enough. Because essentially what you're saying is you're getting a 2 mana 2/3, right? Because at absolute worst, right, your opponent can block your 3/4 wolf with a 1/1, making it a 2/3. So making this a 4/4, so essentially you're paying 2 mana at worst for a 3/3 in green that already likes to be, I would say, more on the aggressive side, right? Like this is a strictly better Colonian Tusker in some ways, or about even with it in other ways, but it's just another like really efficient 2 drop. Um, I'm thinking about maybe Vivian, right? I mean, it's just big stats. So giving it flying, sneak, trample, armor. Um, Prowler actually might be a card you should put in your deck. Um, it's interesting, they're talking about like giving it a nudge to put it in the detonator space, right? The 2 mana 4/4 that has a drawback, even though it's not huge. Yeah, I mean, I think Pasture Prowler might actually see play now, which might just again open up the door a little bit for different types of like green aggro or mid-range strategies, especially if you have ways to like potentially like freely fight the sheep with something. Um, if you basically can even reduce the fact that they can jump with the sheep, then the card just gets really, really good. But I think this is serviceable now. I would say putting this in your deck is reasonable. There's been some talk about the Gauntlet of Overpower, so I'm interested to get into this. Okay, so we're going from 4 mana for 2 charges to 4 mana for 3 charges. Another card that hasn't done much. We want to make this a build around that really pays you off for having cheap evasive creatures. Anyone paying attention to this? Okay. 2 charges was not quite enough to get there. Okay. Sorry, I had my dramatic pause. What new planeswalker cares about cheap evasive creatures? It's Yanling, right? So I think people have talked about. I don't know that it's good. I'll caution everyone there. Um, there was already some talk of trying to play Tolarian Academy in in Yanling decks and playing things like Icy Manipulator, and Ice Crown Scepter just for free card advantage. Gauntlets of Ogre Power, if you're splashing green, right, can make your little swallow that's a 1/2 for 3 mana into a 5/2, right, and just smack your opponent. I mean, again, it's sort of like a win more card, right? Because you have to have good board position, you have to have good threats to do it. But I don't know. Gauntlets of Ogre Power might be worth looking into for specifically Yangling. I don't know where else it would fit, really. Um, that would be the first place I would look. So, well, I'm excited to see if this pans out at all. Okay, Treetop Lookout. Oh, just one of my favorite cards. I mean, I feel like this card, I truly did not get it when Beyond Bounds, one of my teammates who's just, the Domri prodigy, told me, like, you need to be running two of these in your deck. You're going to love it. It's great. And at first, I really was like, oh, man, but, like, it's conditional. Like, it's a 2-mana 3/2, blah, 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 whatever. And this thing is just so good. It was really good, like, I would say this last week when I was grinding. And it's like, you can blank an entire Liliana turn. You can make sure that you close out the game against a fairy. You can blank an entire Vivian turn or Domri turn by shutting off their Worm's Wake. Treetop Lookout actually does so much work in the meta currently. Now, if things shift to aggressive and we're not playing all this trap kind of nonsense, Treetop Lookout gets a little worse. Um, so, it's interesting. They're like, okay, some green decks, might play a 2-mana 3/3, and then there's a bonus for, those conditional matchups. So, I was pretty happy to play Treetop Lookout when it was a 3/2. I'm definitely going to be happy to play it when it's a 3/3. Allows you to fight X2s as well, which is a nice, or like X3s, I guess, is a nice bonus. Um, so, I mean, I'm happy to play this in my green mid-range decks. But I would say specifically Domri just really benefits from this type of card. So, if you've ever been hesitant about putting this in your Domri deck, you have even more reason to be playing this card. So, Alabaster Faith. Okay, interesting. Faith provides a ton of value. Now it's easier for direct damage and other creatures to trade off in combat with the creature you buff. Yeah, I mean, definitely one of the more brutal play patterns coming out of Sarah, for at least aggro, was Watch Wolf into Alabaster Faith. Right, so on turn 3, you've got a 4/5 that's drawing you a card. So +1/+0 definitely means, like, they'll get their card when they play this, right? And maybe you can block, maybe you can't, and then you could fight the creature, and it might be easier, right? Because it's not getting the toughness buff. So that's interesting. I mean, I didn't really think Alabaster Faith was showing up that much, but maybe there's something in their data that they were seeing where that was going to be a problem, or they're anticipating that white or this sort of strategy, especially with the Yanling coming around, would be more dominant, and so they're sort of doing it. Sorry, I jumped the page there. Okay, and this is our last balance change, and then we'll look at bugs. And honestly, I do think it's important because there are, quite frankly, just a lot of bugs in the game, and they do directly impact gameplay. But this last change here, okay, Sigarda is going from a 4/4 for 5 to a 4/3. Sigarda can be a must-answer card, so we are making it easier to answer her by lowering her to 3 health. Interesting. So she really blanks Ral, right? Because it says, not only are you giving creatures wards, so you can't really bounce them, you can't interact with them. It says, you can't be dealt damage except by attacking creatures, right? So that's like it's a clear hoser to Ral. It was a clear hoser to the Devil's strategy. So maybe this is kind of a nod to, like, we would like for there still to be able to be these, like, burn strategies, and we think Sigarda's, like, a little too efficient at answering that. I mean, if they want Chandra to be good, which I could see with a lot of the red changes, making Sigarda be answerable to Flame Shot is a way for Chandra to really do well into that sort of matchup, right? And so lowering it from 4 toughness to 3 toughness definitely gives you more options to deal with it. So interesting. I mean, I think to take stock of all the balance changes, again, shout out to the team at MTG Spellslingers. I think you guys are really putting this game in the right direction. I think you're really trying to think intentionally, and you're trying to be very subtle, and really give people like time to iterate and things to be slower and not as like, here's a big card that's going to take over the meta. I think everything is really going in the right direction, and I'm really happy to see that. I think just a couple takeaways are, I think aggro is getting a nod here. I think there's a bit more permission for aggro to do its thing. Um, control is getting, some tools or some, specifically blue control. So who knows? Maybe that will check it. And mid range, we'll see. I mean, if aggro is fast enough to beat out mid range, it'll be interesting. But yeah, a lot of interesting cards I would not have thought about changing. Um, so I'm really excited just to get in there with all of y'all on the ladder and just try some stuff out and see what happens. Okay, we'll wrap up with the bugs here, and I'll let y'all go. And thank you so much for bearing with me this week. We had a couple videos out. It's been a little slower, just with my work schedule, and we'll be getting more to you soon. So, last couple things. All right, something about Drain tooltip with Soren's profile. Okay, I haven't seen that. Fixed a bug where Vraska's exit ability sometimes caused Fiend Fanatic to draw a random card instead of a devil. Okay, that's pretty big. Okay, fixed a bug where sometimes a vindictive shot destroys a creature that damaged something other than a player. For those of you who did not know, vindictive shot says kill the creature that did the most damage to you this turn. And for whatever reason, you could just block, right, with like your 1/1 sheep into their like 8/8, and you wouldn't have to take the damage, and vindictive shot would still go off. So now Vindictive Shot is working as intended, which is a nerf to Teferi. So look out for that one. Ghoul Tree, I've never seen this card played, but ignores the second creature sent to the graveyard by Stitcher's Supply. Okay, so that was just not working as intended. Fix the bug where Vindictive Shot destroys a creature that dealt 0 or less damage. Yep, that's the same, yeah. Okay, fix the bug where sometimes the sheep created by Pasture Prowler isn't visible. Okay, haven't experienced that. Fix the bug where sometimes Fear the Grave deals extra damage when played by Ashiok. Oh, okay. Fix the bug where sometimes Cursed Crossbreed does not gain flying, even though there's 2 unspent mana. Okay, buff to Cursed Crossbreed actually working as intended. Alright, maybe that'll... I've thought about putting that card in my Domri deck. It just doesn't... I don't know if it's a big enough payoff, but it might be. It might just be, deserve to have a slot. We'll see. We'll see. I should consider that a little bit more. Fix the bug where Elemental Mastery ignores changes to spell cost when calculating total mana. Okay, yeah. I mean, this I remember. Like with Ral, it had the weird interactions where like it would go off when technically you had not spent the mana. So I guess that's going to work as intended now. Fix the bug where Crippling Bolt targeting the knight created by under my watch played in response to steal effect causes repeated errors. Oh, that's unfortunate. Fix the bug where Absent Unsealed ability is triggered by Staring Angel and Angel tokens. Oh, I think I remember this. People were complaining about this, so that's a good fix. Okay, interesting. Well, definitely a lot to digest. Thank you all for dropping by. Let me know what your thoughts in the comments. Let me hear about, do you think they missed the boat? Do you think they're doing right by these changes? Are you excited for certain decks? I mean, I think what we got to get going this week is test out some Yanling, climb on that ladder to Mythic, talk about the decks that I'm feeling for that. Spoiler alert, I think Domri will always be my go-to deck for climbing. It's straightforward, it's powerful, the game's relatively quick. So I might just have to... I know I did a video about that maybe like a month ago, so I might run that back. But let me know what you think in the comments, and good luck out there, Spellslingers. Get that Mythic, get wherever you want to be, and we'll be coming at you with some content this week for Yanling, for some other Planeswalkers, and I will catch you next time. Thanks.